What if I told you that somewhere in the abandoned corridors of St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Hospital in Yorkshire, England, there exists a mirror that defies every law of physics and sanity? A mirror that doesn't show you what you're doing, but what you refuse to see. A mirror that drove 12 people to madness and 3 others to take their own lives before it was finally sealed away in 1970-8. This is the story of the Inversus mirror, and why the British government spent over £2 million to ensure it would never reflect another human face again in 1942. During the height of World War II, Dr. Heinrich Zimmer arrived at St. Bartholomew's Hospital carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. Zimmer had fled Nazi Germany not because of his Jewish heritage, but because his experiments had become too extreme even for the Third Reich. The British government, desperate for any advantage in the war effort, quietly granted him asylum in exchange for his expertise in what they euphemistically called psychological warfare research. What they didn't know was that Zimmer had brought something with him, something he'd salvaged from his laboratory in Berlin before the Gestapo came knocking. A mirror that he claimed could reveal the true nature of the human psyche by showing not what a person was, but what they were desperately trying not to be. The mirror itself appeared unremarkable at first glance. It stood 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, framed in what looked like ordinary black metal. But anyone who looked closely would notice the frame wasn't quite black. It was the deep, light-absorbing darkness of charcoal that had been burned at temperatures far beyond what any normal fire could produce. The glass surface seemed to ripple, occasionally, like water, disturbed by an invisible stone, even when no one was near it. Dr. Margaret Holloway was the first person at St. Bartholomew's to experience what the mirror truly did. As the hospital's chief psychiatrist, she had been assigned to oversee Zimmer's integration into their staff. On a cold February morning in 1943, she followed him into what would become known as Room 13B. Zimmer positioned the mirror against the far wall and invited Dr. Holloway to observe its properties. She approached cautiously, expecting to see her own reflection staring back. Instead, she saw herself, but she was facing the opposite direction, looking intently at something behind her left shoulder. When she turned to see what her reflection was examining, she found nothing but an empty wall. But in the mirror, her reflection continued to stare at that same spot with an expression of growing horror. Dr. Holloway tried moving to different positions, turning her head, even closing her eyes. Nothing changed. Her reflection remained fixed on that invisible point behind her, and with each passing second, the expression on her mirrored face became more terrified, more desperate, until she was forced to look away. That night, Dr. Holloway couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her reflection's face, twisted with fear, staring at something she couldn't see. By morning, she had developed what her colleagues described as a severe case of paranoid behavior, constantly checking behind her left shoulder and refusing to be alone in any room. Within a week, she had requested a transfer to another hospital. Before leaving, she left a single note in her desk drawer. It knows what you've done, it knows what you're hiding, and it will never let you look away. But Dr. Holloway was just the beginning. Zimmer began using the mirror in his therapy sessions, claiming it could help patients confront their deepest psychological barriers by literally showing them what they refused to face about themselves. Patient after patient was brought before the mirror, and patient after patient emerged, fundamentally changed. Thomas Wright, a soldier suffering from what we now call PTSD, saw his reflection perpetually reloading a rifle and firing at invisible targets. After his session, he became obsessed with the idea that he was still killing people, that every action he took was somehow causing death somewhere in the world. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, and eventually stopped moving altogether. Convinced that any motion would result in more invisible carnage, Sarah Chen, a young woman admitted for severe depression following her father's death, saw her reflection continuously reaching out toward empty air, as if trying to grab something just out of reach. She became convinced that her father's spirit was trapped in the space between the real world and the mirror world. and she spent hours each day reaching toward walls and empty spaces, desperately trying to pull him back to reality. But the most disturbing case was that of Father Michael Donnelly, a priest who had volunteered to observe Zimmer's methods as part of the church's investigation into the doctor's work. Father Donnelly saw his reflection kneeling in prayer, but not the peaceful prayer of devotion. His mirrored self was kneeling in terror, hands clasped so tightly that blood seeped between the fingers, mouth open in what appeared to be a silent scream of absolute despair. After his encounter with the mirror, Father Donnelly began conducting Mass in increasingly erratic ways. He would suddenly stop mid-sermon and drop to his knees, praying with such violent intensity that he would injure himself. He claimed that God was not listening, that the prayers were going nowhere, that there was something wrong with the very fabric of faith itself. 3 months later, Father Donnelly was found in his church at 3 a.m, kneeling before the altar with his hands clasped so tightly around a crucifix that it had cut deep into his palms. He had been there for hours, possibly days, and when they tried to move him, they discovered he had died in that position, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Word of these incidents began to spread throughout the hospital, but Zimmer insisted his research was making breakthrough discoveries about the human subconscious. He theorized that the mirror was somehow accessing what he called the shadow self, the part of every person's psyche that contained their deepest fears, guilt, and hidden knowledge about their own true nature. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who replaced Dr. Holloway as chief psychiatrist, decided to investigate these claims scientifically. She arranged for the mirror to be studied by a team of physicists and psychologists from Cambridge University. What they discovered defied explanation. The mirror's surface, when examined under laboratory conditions, showed properties that shouldn't exist. Light didn't simply reflect off it. It seemed to bend and twist in ways that violated basic optical principles. Photography was impossible. The camera would capture only darkness, even with the brightest studio lights. But most disturbing of all, measurements showed that the space behind the mirror was somehow larger than the space in front of it, as if the mirror existed in a pocket of reality where geometry worked differently. Dr. James Whitman, the lead physicist on the team, spent 6 hours taking measurements and observations. When he finally looked into the mirror himself, he saw his reflection working frantically on calculations, writing equation after equation on an invisible blackboard with increasing desperation. In the reflection, he appeared to be crying, his movements becoming more frantic with each passing moment. Dr. Whitman emerged from the session, claiming that the mirror had shown him the fundamental flaw in human understanding of reality. He spent the next 72 hours filling 17 notebooks with mathematical equations that, according to his colleagues, seemed to prove that consciousness itself was a mistake, a glitch in the universe that caused nothing but suffering. On the 4th day, Dr. Whitman walked to the roof of the hospital and threw himself off, clutching one of the notebooks to his chest. The notebook survived the fall, and when examined, it contained only one sentence written over and over again in increasingly erratic handwriting. "We were never supposed to be aware that we exist." By 1945, 12 people had been driven to complete psychological breakdown by the mirror, and 3 had taken their own lives. The hospital administration, under pressure from families and government officials, ordered that Zimmer's research be terminated and the mirror removed from the premises. But Zimmer had become obsessed with his creation. He claimed that the mirror was the key to understanding human consciousness, that it was showing people not their fears, but the truth about reality that their minds were designed to hide from them. He argued that madness wasn't the result of seeing too much, but the natural response to finally seeing things as they really were. On the night before the mirror was scheduled to be removed, Dr. Zimmer locked himself in room 13B for what he called the final experiment. Security guards found him the next morning, standing perfectly still in front of the mirror, his eyes wide open but completely unresponsive. In the mirror, they could see his reflection moving frantically, apparently trying to communicate something urgent, gesturing wildly and appearing to shout, though no sound could be heard. But Zimmer himself remained motionless, catatonic, staring straight ahead with no sign of awareness. He remained in this state for 6 months, during which time his reflection continued its desperate attempts at communication. Nurses reported that sometimes the reflection would appear to be writing on the mirror's surface from the inside, but the words were always backwards and impossible to read. Eventually, Zimmer's body simply stopped functioning. He died standing up, still staring into the mirror, still perfectly motionless. At the moment of his death, witnesses reported that his reflection finally stopped moving, looked directly out of the mirror with an expression of absolute horror, and then slowly backed away into the darkness until it could no longer be seen. The mirror was immediately covered with black cloth and removed from the hospital. For 33 years, it was stored in a government warehouse, sealed in a lead-lined container and monitored by security cameras 24 hours a day. The guards assigned to watch it reported strange incidents, shadows moving behind the cloth covering, sounds of tapping coming from inside the container, and most disturbing of all, the occasional appearance of faces in the reflective surfaces of nearby objects. Faces that seemed to be trying to warn them about something. In 1978, the British government decided that the mirror posed too great a risk to be stored anywhere accessible. They transported it to abandoned mineshaft in Scotland, lowered it 300 feet underground, and sealed the shaft with concrete. The location was classified, the records were buried, and everyone involved was sworn to secrecy. But that's not the end of the story. In 2003, a team of urban explorers broke into the abandoned St. Bartholomew's Hospital. They were filming a documentary about defunct psychiatric facilities when they discovered Room 13B. The room had been sealed since gouges that seemed to spell out words in a dozen different languages. But most disturbing of all, they found what appeared to be a perfect rectangular outline on the far wall, as if something large had been pressed against it for decades. Within this outline, the wall was completely smooth, polished to a mirror-like finish. When the explorers examined their footage later, they discovered something that made them immediately contact the police. In several shots of the room, reflective surfaces, windows, even the lens of their camera, showed brief glimpses of people who weren't there. People in old-fashioned clothing, people in lab coats, people in hospital gowns, all of them facing away from the camera. All of them apparently trying to see something that existed just outside the frame. The police investigation was brief and heavily classified. The building was condemned within a week, and demolition began immediately. But workers on the demolition crew reported that Room 13B couldn't be destroyed. Every attempt to break down the walls resulted in equipment failure. The wrecking ball would stop just short of impact, demolition charges would fail to detonate, and power tools would shut down the moment they touched the room's surfaces. Eventually, they built around it. If you know where to look, in a small park in Yorkshire where St. Bartholomew's Hospital once stood, you can find a patch of grass that's always slightly warmer than the surrounding area. Beneath that patch, sealed in concrete and steel, Room 13B still exists. Local residents report strange incidents. Children playing in the park sometimes stop their games and stare intently at empty air, as if watching something invisible move. Dog walkers find their pets refusing to cross certain areas, whimpering and backing away from apparently normal ground, and most commonly, people report catching glimpses of themselves in shop windows and car mirrors around the area, but always facing the wrong direction, always looking at something just out of sight. The official records state that the Inversus mirror was destroyed in 1970. The government maintains that the incidents at St. Bartholomew's were the result of mass hysteria and experimental psychological techniques that have since been banned. But 3 years ago, a construction crew working on a new shopping centre in Scotland reported a strange discovery. While digging the foundation, they broke through into what appeared to be an old mine shaft. The shaft was empty except for fragments of a lead-lined container and a single piece of black metal that reflected no light at all. The construction was halted, the area was sealed, and the workers were reassigned to other projects. But not before one of them, a man named David Sterling, spent several minutes staring down into the shaft with a flashlight. David Sterling quit his job the next day. When his wife asked him why, he told her that he had seen something impossible. At the bottom of that shaft, he had seen his own reflection staring back up at him, but his reflection had been screaming. David Sterling now lives alone in a small apartment with no mirrors, no reflective surfaces, and curtains drawn at all times. When asked about his experience, he will only say one thing: it's still down there, and it's still showing people what they don't want to see. The question isn't whether the Inversus mirror really existed, or whether it was just an elaborate hoax or mass delusion. The question is simpler and more terrifying. What if there are things about ourselves that we're not meant to see? What if our reflections know something about us that we don't? And what if, somewhere in the darkness beneath Scotland, something is still waiting to show us the truth about who we really are? The next time you look in a mirror, pay attention to your reflection's eyes. Make sure they're looking at the same thing you are. Because according to the few surviving witnesses of the Inversus mirror, the first sign that something has gone wrong isn't that your reflection looks different, it's that your reflection refuses to look at you at all. Sweet dreams.